Ryan, you seem like a nice guy. I'm gonna make a special deal for you. 1 month free, $500 gift card, and a 50% reduction in pet deposits and fees. That's an actual concession that's in the marketplace today. I'm going to be talking a bit about concessions. I'm going to talk about the market statistics and a lot of things that I see going on in rentals all around the state. As Ryan said, I do market feasibility studies on rentals of all kinds. So I'm going to give you the perspective of what I'm seeing. The market's holding up pretty well, but there are some weaknesses, and there have been some important differences in performance among different types of locations, different markets, different types of buildings, different price points. And things are a bit uncertain, of course, with economic relief from the government. Some things are being worked out on a bipartisan basis. It looks like there will be some relief, but it'll be lower than what we saw before. So there may be some people that still need to double up, taking on roommates and so on. But this high level of deliveries is what I want to talk about. And we've kind of had a collision of the high deliveries with the demand that's gone down. So last couple of years, we've seen 290,000 deliveries, according to ALN. Through the first 10 months of the year, it was 240,000. So it looks like this year is going to turn out to be about 290,000 again. So pretty similar as what we had seen before. So here's what I want to talk about today. First of all, slower lease-up velocity. This trend was already going on, and it's just accelerated. Number two, rents. Rents are rising again in most areas, even compared with a year ago, but some areas like Orlando have seen continued decreases in effective rents, reflecting higher concessions. Number three, deliveries of new apartments have continued at fairly high levels, adding competitive supply. Number four, the pandemic has had two negative effects: health concerns and economic concerns. Read income. In other words, can I stay out of contagion proximity if I live in a multifamily building, and can I afford my rent and still feed my family? Number five, Class A, B, and C have had different experiences. Class A has had a higher rate of collections, but has also felt the most pressure on rents. A higher level of price sensitivity has pushed some demand from Class A to Class B. Number seven, I talked about concessions a little bit. In some areas, concessions are characterized with terms like desperate or vicious. Number eight, I'm going to do a case study, or probably two of them, to kind of show some of the research that I'm doing right now and how things are playing out. The recent pattern of ups and downs in apartment performance over the past year or so might be able to tell us how to think about 2021. The first half of 2020 saw a decrease in demand due to the pandemic, down to levels lower than the pace of new construction. But by the third quarter of the year, CBRE data shows that demand had regained enough strength, particularly in the South and West, to once again pull ahead of the pace of new apartment completions. This exhibit, which is from CBRE, used with permission, shows that for the first 3 quarters of 2020, the pace of completions is higher than during the first 3 quarters of last year. And you look at the bars over on the far right-hand side of the graph for this. And the pace of absorption so far has been far lower. This is across all classes of apartments. We'll see that you have to look at the data for the classes of apartments one by one, which brings us to this. Data from ALN showing the kind of spectrum of apartments and quality levels. Class A has seen the most pressure on occupancy rates and effective rents, and here you see on absorption. This was in part due to the completion of a large number of new buildings coming out just when demand was softening. During the first 10 months of 2020, the only class to lose ground in average occupancy among stabilized properties was Class A, with a 1.3% decline to 92%. Again, that's ALN data. This is not an alarmingly low figure, but it is a few percentage points lower than the other price classes, which finished between 94% and 95% occupancy. The culprit for average occupancy decrease was negative demand. Net absorption was negative by 12,000 units on a year-to-date basis. For context, During the same 10-month period of 2019, stabilized Class A properties added more than 11,000 units absorbed. In the third quarter of 2020, all classes of apartments saw a very welcome reduction in vacancies compared with the second quarter, though they are still higher than before the pandemic, of course. Achieving this improvement did require some increases in concessions in Class A buildings. 2 weeks free has become fairly common to attract new tenants. Now, I want to also show you some kind of scholarly data. This is from the Harvard Joint Center on Housing Studies. They just put out a book last month, which is a once-a-year study they do called The State of the Nation's Housing. And in that, they validated and verified some of the things that people on the morning panel were talking about, which is the distress is not happening in the suburban markets by and large. But you look at the urban markets around the country, especially the large ones and the most urban areas within the prime urban markets, those are where the vacancy rates have gone up the highest. One of the very brightest of the bright spots in the supply-demand picture is the pace at which households are being formed now, driven in large part by millennials getting a place of their own, splitting off from roommates or relatives with whom they've been sharing a place. The pace of household formations is one of the most important indicators of the demand for new residences, for sale, for rent, everything across the board. The Joint Center for Housing Studies tabulated data from the Census Bureau, now showing that the pace of household formations is holding at 1.5 million per year, way higher than in previous years. One of the most important shifts in the rental market in this cycle, by the way, has been the rise of the high-income renter. These tenants, of course, are called renters by choice because they could buy a home if they wanted to, but they simply prefer renting for the flexibility and maintenance-free lifestyle that it offers. The Harvard report shows that higher income households, defined as those at $75,000 and up in income, make up half of the growth in renter households. That amounts to 4.6 million new households nationally during the last 15 years. Their share of renter households, that income group, jumped from 18% to 26%. I believe this is a trend that'll persist. But there are some concerns, of course. There have been jobs lost, a lot of people on long-term unemployment, a lot of people doubling up as a result. And double up households are fine from the standpoint of somebody comes in with a roommate, they rent a place that helps demand. But what hurts demand is when you have two households that become one. You have also issues with some renters coming in and they can't qualify to rent because they don't have good enough credit. So lease-ups are slower, at least in a lot of submarkets. You take Orlando, theme park layoffs have affected some submarkets there. And there's still a lot of people who are laid off. The impact has been much heavier on blue-collar workers than on white-collar workers. And that has had an impact on what apartments will be in demand in the future. I think there will be a strong turn around in the employment picture somewhere in the middle of 2021. More stimulus is coming, although not as much as we had this year. There will be some hardship, particularly in that group that would be typically Class C rentals. Florida seems determined not to have another economic shutdown, but I'm not so sure about the theme parks for the next 4 or 5 months. And even if restaurants and so on aren't forced to close like they are doing in California, business will be down. Hospitality workers and restaurant workers are going to have a tough time for the next few months. Florida benefits, though, from more businesses moving to Florida from New York. Goldman Sachs just announced this morning that they're going to relocate their asset management group from Manhattan to Florida, probably Fort Lauderdale or north of Miami, somewhere, maybe the West Palm Beach area. Now, one thing I want to note, too, is as you look at this 1.5 million households that I've highlighted here, you have to take the analysis a step further. You take those 1.5 million households, some of them are going to be people looking to buy a home, especially with interest rates this low. So you have to take those out. And then the apartment renters or the renters in general, then the next step in the decision tree is, do I rent an apartment or do I rent a single family home? The SFR, BFR business has really exploded, as everybody knows. We'll talk about that further down in the discussion. But then you take that group that says, I want to rent an apartment. Then you have to divide that into, are they singles, couples, roommates, family, just to name a few of the main categories. And then you add all that together, and that creates your total demand for rental apartments. And then you can filter that further by renters by choice, renters by need, people that are just looking for a place short-term versus those that are looking for a place long-term. All that boils down to your analysis of your absorption for your site. Well, let's take a look at things on a regional basis. So this is data from CBRE, the third quarter information, and it's for the southeastern US. This is a Florida conference. So I'm going to highlight the Florida markets and dig down into those. So here's Orlando, which was down 3.4% in rent year on year, but quarter on quarter, it's flat. So hopefully we've hit the bottom, although as we'll see in some more data that I'm going to show in a moment, it looks like it's not at all for sure that Orlando has finally hit bottom in terms of effective rents because concessions keep going higher. Fort Lauderdale was down 1.3% in rents, then flat. West Palm Beach pretty much flat and then flat. Miami down and down not quite as much. And then we look at the stronger markets, Jacksonville and Tampa. They're holding up very well. In the third quarter, absorption came back positive in every Florida metro except for Miami, which was flat, according to RealPage. I like to use a lot of different data sources here. You see me utilizing a lot of the resources that I that I use in my daily work. So let's take a look at some markets and put them side by side. Here's West Palm Beach. What I like here is that although West Palm Beach had a severe drop in rents, the rents have already come back up to where they were before the crisis. And that's true for more or less for market rents as well as, stated rents and effective rents. Occupancies are still somewhat down. Well, let's compare that to Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale didn't get hit as hard as West Palm Beach. So it's now well above where it was, both in terms of stated rents and effective rents compared to before the crisis. Occupancies, again, are still a problem. Now, again, you have to look at the market. You always have to drill down, right? So I've done some market studies recently for sites for new apartments in Plantation and Coconut Creek, and those Western Broward submarkets are pretty strong. And then you go to the downtowns, and I think that the downtown locations somewhat struggling now to some degree. The A-plus locations are going to be fine. And, especially since a building that's getting started under construction today is going to take 3 years to develop. By the time you get to 2023, the COVID crisis will be a long distant memory, and I think that the market will be back in good shape. Now here's Jacksonville. This is one of the strongest markets in the entire country, and it's absolutely one of the strongest in Florida. You see that there was only a momentary dip in effective rents and stated rents, and look at those occupancy rates. They're actually higher than before the crisis. Jacksonville is a very diversified economy. It's not so dependent on tourism and hospitality. It's also got defense as kind of a stabilizer. A lot of defense contracts come through there. This is one of the few MSAs in the country, actually, where occupancy is trending up. Tampa is another one of those, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Then we get to Orlando. Now, what you see here is the rents still going down, both on a stated rent basis and an effective rent basis. Occupancies still struggling, and it's very different from what we saw in West Palm Beach and in these other markets. Orlando's hospitality-heavy economy is under a lot of strain. And it's not only the tourism and the theme park layoffs, it's also business travel. And looking forward, The large conventions may not be as numerous going forward, which reduces business for those hotels and the convention center. There are 11% fewer jobs now in the Orlando economy than there were in February. The only other US metros with losses of that magnitude are Las Vegas and New York. Orlando also faces the challenge of construction that's pretty robust compared to the rest of the state. There are There are 14,200 units on the way in the Orlando MSA, and that'll grow the stock by 5.9%. That's a lot. The other stat worth noting in Orlando is that resident retention when leases end is falling. The latest retention figure from RealPage is 46%, off from 52% a year earlier. We can also drill down into the Orlando market and look at where the pain is being felt the most. The areas closest to the theme parks are getting clobbered, while the suburban markets on the north side and over in Lake Nona and places like that are in relatively good shape. And we heard the contrarian on the panel this morning, Tim Peterson, saying he sees Orlando as a counter-cyclical play. He says that, look, people are going to probably, after the crisis is over, they're going to opt for domestic travel vacations more than international ones. So I think that's an interesting play. Now, if we compare, going back to the West Palm Beach graph, Palm Beach County, there's a nice U-shaped recovery there, as opposed to Orlando, where market rents have kind of just gone in an L shape and still trending downward for effective rents. Now here's Tampa. This is a very strong market relative to some of these others that have been hit so hard on the tourism and hospitality side. There was certainly a hit in the spring and ended around the summertime. And now we see rents, including effective rents, going back up, and they're above where they were before the crisis. And look at the occupancy rates, well above where they were before the crisis ever began. And then you have to look at by submarket. Downtown, submarket, South Tampa, New Tampa, Wesley Chapel are seeing very strong rebounding occupancies and rents. Now here's Miami. In this particular case, I combined new lease-up properties with the already existing properties. So when you look at that, you see kind of a slow climb, not a drastic reduction, but kind of just a slow climb and a bit of a rebound after the distress kind of started to wind down. Miami, within the three South Florida metros, Miami is struggling the most. And that has a lot to do also with the shadow market, that is the condos that are offered for lease. I spoke last week with Greg Willett, the chief economist at RealPage, and he said his numbers show that occupancy is down 110 basis points year over year to 95.2%, and rents are down 3.2% from year ago rates. And there are 12,900 units under construction, according to RealPage, in the Miami market, and that amounts to an increase in the inventory of 4.2%. And again, the ALN numbers are a little different from what I just stated because those include the new lease-ups. And by the way, I also talked with somebody at Rental Beast. They said their inquiries are down 30% year on year in Miami, and concessions are up 115%. Let's talk about product a little bit. Okay, so I think that there will be some changes in the way developers think about their amenity space and about even what they put in the units and in the buildings and lobbies and so on. I recently heard a developer lament, amenities used to be about getting people together. Now it's all about keeping people apart. I couldn't disagree more. It's like what my daughter's principal said, we should never do social distancing. We may sometimes have to physically distance, but we have to keep people socially connected. And I think that we can think about ways to do that with the amenity spaces. Bring the yoga class out onto the pool deck or out onto the amenity deck on the podium or on the rooftop or whatever it might be. And another thing I want to say is that I think that new developments, new rental buildings have an opportunity to actually gain some comparative advantage over the older buildings. And by older, I mean pre-COVID. So I think you're going to see more emphasis on things like upgraded air filtration, antimicrobial surfaces. And these become selling points for the new buildings. Larger and more numerous balconies. I think, people want to get that outside air. They consider that to be healthier. It feels better. And, a separate entry for deliveries is also being talked about in a lot of places. In some of the luxury building, touchless systems, touchless elevators, touchless doors. Of course, that doesn't work in the economic model for every project. It doesn't work for your, surface park walk-up building. But for the more luxury buildings, the taller buildings, it sometimes can work. Some developers are talking about retractable glass walls or fixed partitions in common areas. Again, I mentioned the rooftop terraces for the high rises, separate rooms in the fitness center or partitions, in-unit laundries. So some of these things are kind of easy. Some of them will take more work. And I think that you have to use your own judgment and use your own economic model to see which things work. And, to a degree, it's playing on psychology. Whether or not these things really make people healthier may not be the point. People may not be using their frontal cortex to make these decisions. It may be more the limbic system and their lizard brain saying, make my family healthier, protect my family and my own health. So think about that in your marketing. Back to the Harvard analysis. This is an interesting exhibit. The Harvard study shows that over a long timeline, rents have risen the fastest in large buildings. Over the past 15 years, rents have risen by 30% in buildings of 20 units or more, but much more like half that in smaller apartment buildings. And then they also showed data on single family homes. And I know some of you have been talking about single family for rent on one level or another. Single family homes for rent have been experiencing strong increases in rents for the past 15 years, and they've shot up even faster since the pandemic hit, driven by people wanting to have their own entrance, private outdoor space, a garage, a spare room for a home office. The increased availability of built-for-rent single-family homes in some markets has created another source of competition for apartment buildings, although single-family home communities rarely match up to the suite of recreational amenities that an upscale apartment complex typically offers. I want to go quickly run through a case study. This is a development called 72 Park. I just completed the study a couple months ago, and the developer is planning on building this project in Mid-Beach, in Miami Beach. Location is here. You'll notice that it's adjacent to this new town center, which is a special zoning district. The city has redone the park and the band shell, and there's more renovation, a lot of improvements being made, a lot of investment in the public infrastructure. And this is an example of a project where, as I mentioned, the balconies, these are the balconies that they're planning. They wrap around the whole building. And even the smallest units have very large balconies that increase their space by more than 20%. It kind of reminds me of this balcony trend in general. I mean, it reminds me of, in the Gold Coast of Queensland, Australia, that it's pretty much universal to see 10 by 12 foot balconies, whereas here maybe 5 by 8 was more normal. But I think, again, you're going to see more of these large balconies in the near future. So here is the location and some of the public infrastructure that's nearby, the parks and other public spaces. Let's talk about the study findings. We looked at the psychographics of the area and mapped kind of where the people come from that will be the types of families and people that will rent in this building, singles and couples and so on. And then we looked at the demographics in the area. There's a site location. Let's get into the statistics a little bit. So, it's absolutely crucial to draw a distinction between the supply-demand fundamentals on the mainland of Miami and those on Miami Beach. Most of the new development over the past 18 months took place in central Miami and comprised many of the high-rises in Edgewater, Wynwood, Midtown Miami, and downtown, which reduced occupancy to 80%. Conversely, Miami Beach, with no new development, has the highest occupancy at 94%. There's been negative absorption in Miami recently, but not in Miami Beach. Miami Beach has experienced strong occupancy over the past 5 years. And the absence of new supply and steady demand has supported rents and occupancies in Miami Beach. And overall, these kind of facts and circumstances support the development of this development, 72 Park. So here are the comps we looked at on the apartment side. Most of them are on the mainland because that's where the supply is. We found that there's an unmet need, but we also looked at the condo shadow supply competition. And then we looked at the future planned apartments, looked at the lease up rates of the existing supply, and then ultimately came up with this analysis. So what we did was create a scatter plot, and we did this for each of the bedroom types. So here's the 2-2 example. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just this one to show these little squares indicate where where we recommend the subject is priced. And these prices that you see for the comps went through our analysis where we did some adjustments. Now, you can't just look and compare apples with oranges. You have to make adjustments for the age of the property. You have to adjust for the location. You have to adjust for the quality of the amenities, the quality of the building, and all of these things taken into account. This leads us to where the attainable pricing could be for that building. I know we're running low on time, but I do want to quickly run through a topic that I know a number of you have talked about, which is the built for rent single family trend. These are some of the projects that we're watching around the state of Florida for built for rent. You got the flight to the suburbs driving this, the millennials having kids, people want to have office space, singles, couples, empty nesters. Pretty much the dashboard is showing a lot of favorable statistics and metrics that support built for rent. But there's more to think about. It's not just a no-brainer. You have to think about segmentation, especially because more and more people are piling into this. So I'm telling the people that I consult for in this arena to choose wisely, figure out what kind of product you want to do and why. As I look at my forecast, we're at 60,000 built for rent units. I project for this year, I think it's going to go to 80,000 next year, 100,000. So by 2022, 2023, you better be segmented because the certain submarkets are going to be crowded. A lot of these players are going into the same submarkets. So that's going to be an important thing to watch out for. And this kind of gives you the evolution of the niche. As more and more players have piled in, there's going to be that list for 2021 is going to grow even more. And I'm working with some of these players that are getting more and more involved in the state of Florida as well. Quick case study for built for rent. This is Next Metro. They're coming into Florida. They just are starting a project in the Tampa area. Here's one of their projects over in Arizona, though, just where they came from, just to show you the metrics and how things are exploding. They pro forma at $1.36 a square foot. Actual starting rate came in at $1.57 a foot. Now they're at $1.70 a square foot. So these are some of the built for rent projects that I've looked into that are getting started. Estia down there in the bottom. Interesting, they're getting a lot of demand. They're filling up fast, and they're getting more 55 plus renters that they had anticipated. That's actually a project within the Lakewood Ranch master plan community over in the Sarasota, Bradenton area. The same group is going to be starting a built for rent community at Waterside, and they're going to be moving dirt any day now. And this is a project by Clean Living Communities, Cantabria. So in conclusion, I think that multifamily will land on its feet. Renters by choice are going to continue to be a big factor. That's going to drive your Class A demand back up again. I think we're going to see somewhat of a V-shaped recovery sometime in the latter part of next year in this Class A segment. And, even if there's continued distress, which there will be, that may drive some more people to rent who ordinarily would have looked to buy. So I'm very bullish on the future. I do think that, as some of the panelists this morning said, there's opportunities for repurposing properties like hotels. And overall, I think that there's a great future ahead for multifamily in Florida. So with that, I will return the podium to Ryan for Q&A.
Great. Yeah, if you could just turn off the presentation so we can see you a little better.
Yeah.
There we go. So yeah, let me take a look at some of these questions here. So if you're looking to ask questions of Brad, just click on Q&A there to the right-hand side. Don't use chat, use Q&A. So a couple people are asking about getting a copy of the presentation. Are you willing to distribute some form of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I will. I'll do that. I'll be happy to share. Yeah.
All right, I'll work with you on getting that to folks. We saw, I guess, both in Jacksonville and Tampa, some upward trends. What are some of the drivers of those? It seems surprising given COVID, but
yeah, I mean, it's a matter of diverse economies. Orlando is a diverse economy, but it does certainly have its overweight dependence on hospitality and travel and tourism and so on. So Jacksonville has the benefit of some defense employment, as well as just a more diverse economy. And Tampa, the same thing. Tampa is a very diverse economy, and I think that it really correlates very heavily with exposure to the tourism sector.
Okay. And how do Florida's rental markets compare with? I mean, we heard about sort of the southeastern Florida, but what about other markets around the country? How does Florida stack up there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you've heard, there's no single Florida market, so it's tricky to say how Florida compares. But if you're in Orlando, you're worse off than the rest of the country. But even Orlando isn't as bad off as, say, San Francisco or Oakland, California, or Las Vegas. Jacksonville and Tampa, like we talked about, are two of the strongest markets in the entire country when you look at the rate at which they've bounced back from the pandemic. West Palm Beach has come back very nicely, and Fort Lauderdale's in good shape. Miami is weak right now, but it will come back. And the best locations are going to do just fine. What's fascinating is the continued New York influx into South Florida. Back in the summer, New York was a basket case, right? And they were parking Navy hospital ships off of Manhattan and putting up large hospital tents in the middle of Central Park. And once New York got their outbreak under control, it started to explode in Florida as people started to come down and buy homes and rent homes here, particularly in Miami. That said, the New Yorkers are continuing to flock to South Florida, despite despite the level of contagion that we have here. From talking with a number of brokers, the mentality is, if I'm going to be forced to self-isolate and quarantine in my home, I'd rather do that in Florida than in New York. Plus, with so many of the things shut down that make New York what it is, it's not as exciting as normal. So that's part of it. But certainly compared to some of the other markets in the country out in California, where effective asking rents are down year on year by 17.4% in San Francisco, and down by 13.8% in San Jose, 13.1% in New York. So that's from RealPage. Those are way worse than what we're seeing in Florida.
And you had mentioned the single-family home as a sort of a competitor. I've heard that the market's obviously doing really well for home buying right now, in terms of prices and demand. Yeah. But maybe you could kind of give us, the thinking of renters, when they're looking at single-family versus rental, multifamily rentals. How do the two markets compare? Like, how does what should say the multifamily owners, investors and developers here on this call be thinking about?
Sure. I mean, there is a spread in rents between rental apartments and built for rent in favor of the built for rent single family. And the spreads are all over the place. I've done studies in the last few months where the spread was 20% or even close to 30%. I've also done studies where the spread has been very small. The variables are the age of the homes in the single family SFR stock and the quality, lot sizes, improvements to the house on the property, such as a swimming pool, the level of maintenance or renovations to the home. And if I had to give you an average, I'd say something in the range of 15 to 20% when you adjust for all those factors. I just looked at a deal in Central Florida right near the Villages. There are a lot of healthcare workers there, not enough housing to satisfy the demand from nurses, x-ray technicians, visiting professors, and everybody else. And in that location, SFR comps are typically around 85 to 95 cents a square foot. But American Homes for Rent has a community there of single family homes for rent that's renting in the $1.20 to $1.22 per square foot range. So another factor that causes the wide variance is the level of amenities provided at the built for rent communities. There are a lot of players in that space that are running with the philosophy that people don't care about amenities. They want the amenity being they have a yard and they have a garage and they have no attached walls. But as to how renters compare the two, which is kind of really your question, the key difference is the yard and the garage for many renters. If it's a family, then bedroom count is crucial. And a lot of people in our industry think about rent per square foot. But remember that the garage is not counted in the rent per square foot typically, but it's counted in the minds of that renter that wants that extra space, maybe for that, for just the storage that it allows, and for the extra living space that it can allow, or home office space that it can allow.
Cool. And we have a question here that's kind of dialing into the South Florida markets a bit deeply. So let us know if you can answer this off the cuff. Like, how do you see secondary South Florida markets like Hollywood, Hollandale perform versus sort of more primary South Florida markets, like Miami, Fort Lauderdale, in terms of recovery, occupancy, rent growth, anything you've got?
Sure. I think that the less urban markets, if you will, that are sort of secondary markets, actually have certain advantages in that they didn't quite get the same level of people didn't just sort of back up the dump truck and pour millions and millions of square feet into those areas like they did in the kind of core areas. So I think that it's actually a smart idea to look at those secondary areas, and I think that they're going to do very well. I think that you'll see a nice rebound in those areas. And
I don't understand this question entirely, but I think I get the gist of it. Like, do you see any trends for sort of proximity to COVID outbreaks, in terms of short-term value, with people not being able to use amenities or anything like that?
Yeah, so there's two ways to look at that. On one hand, you can say, okay, well, here in my Florida location, Florida rental project, people might be, turned off because they can't use the amenities. But there's a flip side to that, which is if you're in New York City, you can't use New York City. So to a degree, I think that we will see a mitigation of the problem that we have here by virtue of the fact that I think some of the demand can come from the Northeast or other parts of the country. I heard on the morning panel that they're seeing people coming from California. So, I think that there are certain aspects of Florida that will still seem very attractive to renters, even if the outbreak increases in intensity, which it's going to. But I think that we'll actually be able to weather it relatively well. And in many ways, we have already weathered this outbreak relatively well. As I said at the very beginning of my presentation, I think that the Florida markets have performed better than many people feared. And especially in terms of collections, a lot of people thought, with these forbearance programs, everybody's going to quit paying their rent, and collections are still holding up very well, especially in the Class A.
Great. So we're coming up on sort of the 45-minute mark where we're going to transition to the networking. And I just want to ask you to stick around if you don't mind, connect with some of the folks. I'm going to ask you one more question, but just wanted to, ask you to kind of stick around. I'm sure people have some questions because we have some questions here that won't get answered. And if you don't mind just spending, a little bit of time with us. Sure. But the last question here, also pandemic related, do you see like any sort of relationship between small business and restaurant failures going forward? in relationship to multifamily. It's sort of what is the connection between retail and multifamily today, whether it's in rents, valuations, things like that, is particularly focused on failures of smaller businesses and restaurants.
Sure. Well, so there's two aspects to it. There's the demand aspect, which is if retail isn't doing well in an area, and that area is very heavily dependent on the restaurant and hospitality business, then that area is disproportionately hit. But then the other side of that is the opportunity to convert retail space into residential space, and I think that's another repurposing play that I think is going to get a lot of traction going forward.
Great. Well, Brad, I want to thank you for joining us. This has been terrific. I'm